She was just a waitress. At least that's what Thomas Jenkins thought when he screamed at her in front of a table of international investors worth more than small countries. He called her dumb. He called her barely competent. He made jokes about unskilled labor in 3 different languages, assuming she couldn't understand a single word. He had no idea she'd built immigration consultancy bridges between governments. He had no idea she was fluent in 7 languages. And he absolutely had no idea that every investor at his table was silently calculating whether a man this arrogant was worth billions of their money. What happened next? She answered him in Mandarin, then switched to German, then French. She corrected his mistranslations, exposed the cultural insults he'd accidentally thrown at his own investors, and calmly explained exactly why his billion-dollar deal was about to collapse, all without raising her voice once. This billionaire went from master of the universe to the most incompetent person at his own lunch. And it all started with one wrong bottle of wine. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will remind you that the person you underestimate is often the one holding all the cards you didn't know were in play. This is the story of the day I stopped making myself small. While you're here, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to hide how smart you really are just to survive? Let me know where you're watching from. You know, there's something dangerous about being invisible. When nobody sees you, you start to believe you don't exist. When nobody hears you, you forget the sound of your own voice. And for 2 years, that's exactly what I'd done. Erased myself, piece by piece, language by language, until I was just a pink uniform refilling water glasses. My name is Andriana Johnson, and I'm about to tell you about the afternoon I stopped apologizing for being brilliant. I worked at Skyline 47, one of those rooftop restaurants where the view costs more than the food. The kind of place where billionaires close deals over $800 steaks while the city spreads out beneath them like a kingdom they already own. I was a waitress there, just another woman in pink, moving between tables with a practiced smile, clearing plates, translating menus in my head for fun, and making sure no one ever looked at me twice. That was the agreement I'd made with the world. I would stay quiet and the world would let me survive. I was 27 years old, and I'd already learned that being smart while black and female meant being a target. So I hid. I dimmed myself down until I was just background noise. My uniform was always spotless, my hair pulled into a neat updo, my face carefully blank. I never corrected anyone. I never showed off. I never let them see what I could do. I woke up at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of a city that never actually slept, just pretended to rest between shifts of ambition. My apartment was a studio in a neighborhood the tourism boards didn't photograph. 3 floors up, radiator that clanked like it had opinions, and a window that faced a brick wall so close I could touch it if I leaned out far enough. I didn't lean out. I'd learned not to reach for things that weren't meant for me. The pink uniform hung on the back of my door like a flag of surrender, pressed sharp, name tag pinned exactly 2 inches below the collar, just like the manual specified. I'd ironed it the night before because showing up with wrinkles meant showing up as someone who couldn't handle details. And in a place like Skyline 47, details were everything. I slipped it on, pulled my hair into the kind of bun that said professional but not threatening, and checked my reflection one last time. Neutral face, soft eyes, the kind of woman who blends into marble and crystal without disturbing anything important. The commute was 2 trains and a bus, squeezed between construction workers and nurses ending night shifts, all of us wearing our exhaustion like a second uniform. I used to read on the train, academic journals, linguistics papers, anything that kept my brain sharp. Now I just stared at my phone, scrolling through nothing, because reading made me remember what I used to be. Dr. Andriana Johnson, they'd called me, consultant, bridge builder, the woman who could walk into a room of diplomats speaking 4 different languages and make them all feel heard. That was before Marcus Chen decided my success made him look small. Before he buried my consultancy under fabricated ethics complaints and whispered rumors to every client we shared. Before promising rising star became liability we can't touch in the span of 3 carefully placed phone calls. So now I was invisible by design. I refilled water glasses and listened to men like Thomas Jenkins bark orders in Mandarin to impress dates who didn't speak it. And I smiled and pretended I didn't notice he'd just accidentally called the woman across from him a kitchen appliance. I collected languages the way other people collected tips. German from table 12, Arabic from the private dining room, French from the couple arguing near the window. I never corrected anyone. That was the rule. Smart women got crushed. Quiet women got paychecks. Thomas Jenkins didn't walk into Skyline 47. He arrived like weather. You felt him before you saw him, the way the air pressure drops before a storm. The hostess straightened her spine. The sommelier adjusted his tie. Even Richard, our floor manager, who'd worked here for 15 years and had seen presidents and oil sheiks, touched his earpiece twice and cleared his throat into the silence that always preceded important men. I was folding napkins near the service station when the elevator doors opened on the 47th floor. Thomas stepped out first, silver hair catching the afternoon light like he'd personally negotiated with the sun for better angles. His suit was charcoal pinstripe, the kind that cost more than my yearly rent, cut so precisely it looked like armor. Behind him came the entourage. 3 men in dark suits, 2 women in business attire that probably had names I couldn't pronounce, and 1 man in a blue suit who walked half a step behind everyone else, watching everything with eyes that catalog details the way I used to. Thomas moved through the restaurant like he owned the space between molecules. People leaned away without realizing it. Conversations dropped in volume as he passed. He didn't acknowledge the staff. We were furniture that happened to breathe. But you could feel his presence rearranging the room's geometry around his expectations. Andriana. Richard's voice was low, controlled, the tone he used when something was about to go sideways. You're taking the terrace table. My stomach dropped. The terrace was where the real power sat, where deals that moved billions got signed over wine that cost thousands. It was also where egos were most fragile and mistakes most visible. Richard, I'm not on terrace rotation today. You are now. He pressed a small leather portfolio into my hands. Mr. Jenkins requested someone who wouldn't make a fuss. Someone calm. The way he said it felt like an apology and a warning braided together. Just keep your head down, stay invisible, and we'll all get through this intact. I watched Thomas settle into his chair on the terrace, the skyline spreading behind him like a kingdom he'd already conquered. His investors arranged themselves around the table, languages I recognized from cadence alone, postures that spoke of old money and older power. The man in the blue suit sat directly across from Thomas, silent, observing. Richard squeezed my shoulder once. You'll be fine. Just don't engage. But I'd already recognized the trap. Men like Thomas didn't request calm staff because they valued peace. They requested targets who wouldn't fight back. The first 15 minutes went smoothly, which should have been my warning. I took drink orders in 3 languages without flinching, brought out the amuse-bouche precisely timed, and refilled water glasses with the kind of invisible efficiency that made me good at this job. Thomas barely glanced at me. His attention was locked on the investors, voice booming about market projections and unprecedented opportunities, painting himself as the architect of empires. Then came the wine. The German investor, silver-haired, precise in his movements, had ordered in his native tongue, speaking quickly, something about a specific vintage from the Mosel region. I noted it perfectly, repeated it back in German to confirm. But when I returned from the cellar with the sommelier selection, Thomas was mid-sentence about his expansion into Berlin, and I made the mistake of approaching while he was performing. I set the bottle down gently. The label faced the German investor as protocol demanded. Thomas stopped talking. The silence that followed had teeth. That's not what he ordered. His voice cut across the terrace like a blade testing sharpness. He didn't look at me, just gestured dismissively at the bottle. He specifically asked for the 2015. This is 2016. My pulse kicked up. I'd heard 2016. I was certain I'd heard 2016. But the German investor was already frowning, glancing between Thomas and the bottle, and I understood in that instant what was happening. This wasn't about wine. This was about Thomas establishing hierarchy, showing his guests he controlled even the smallest details of their experience. My apologies, sir. I'll retrieve the correct vintage immediately. My voice came out steady, professional, empty of everything I was feeling. You'd think they'd train people to listen. Thomas turned to his guest with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But I suppose attention to detail isn't exactly a priority in this labor pool. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled around the table. The woman in the sharp blazer looked down at her menu. Only the man in the blue suit watched me, expression unreadable. I picked up the bottle, felt the weight of it in my hands. 400 euros of glass and liquid that represented half my weekly paycheck. The German investor murmured something apologetic, but Thomas waved him off magnanimously, already moving back into his pitch like I'd ceased to exist the moment I stopped being useful for his demonstration. I walked back inside, spine straight, face neutral, hands steady. The heat of humiliation crawled up my neck like a living thing. I could endure this. I'd endured worse. The check from this shift would cover groceries and the electric bill. That was what mattered. But my fingers trembled slightly as I set the bottle down in the service station, and I hated that they did. The main course arrived during what I'd later learn was the collapse of Thomas's entire negotiation strategy. I could hear it in his voice as I approached with the first plate, that edge of desperation dressed up as confidence, the way powerful men sound when they're losing control and trying to hide it with volume. The Chinese investor was speaking, measured and deliberate, raising concerns about cultural integration and local partnerships. Thomas was deflecting, talking over him, redirecting to profit margins. The tension at the table had shifted from polite business to something sharper. I set down the first plate in front of the woman in the blazer, moved clockwise, stayed invisible. I was reaching for the second plate when Thomas gestured broadly, his hand catching the edge of his water glass. It tipped, spilled across the white tablecloth, drops hitting the Chinese investor's folder. Everything stopped. Thomas looked at the water, looked at me, and I watched something cold slide behind his eyes. "Are you kidding me right now?" He didn't shout, not yet. His voice was tight, controlled, the kind of anger that knows it has an audience. "Do you have any idea what those documents are worth?" "Sir, I started, but the glass had tipped toward him. We both knew that, and it didn't matter." He stood. The scrape of his chair against stone sounded like a sentencing. He moved around the table toward me, and suddenly I was very aware of how tall he was, how much space he took up, how his shadow fell across me like a verdict already decided. His finger jabbed the air between us. This is exactly the problem. You hire people who can't think past their next tip, who can barely manage basic service, and you wonder why nothing runs smoothly. His voice rose, carrying across the terrace, turning heads at other tables. "You're barely competent on your best day, and today clearly isn't that." My throat closed. The plate was still in my hand, growing heavier. He switched to Mandarin, a sharp burst of words aimed at the Chinese investor with a laugh that invited participation. I caught every syllable. These people are useless without supervision. Like expecting monkeys to serve dinner. The investor's face went carefully blank. The woman in the blazer looked away. The man in the blue suit leaned back slightly, phone screen glowing in his hand at an angle that might have been recording, might have been nothing. Thomas turned back to me, leaning down, towering, his cologne expensive and suffocating. "Maybe try focusing instead of daydreaming about whatever simple thoughts occupy that empty head. Think you can manage that? Or should I request someone with an actual education?" My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from the pressure of holding everything back. Every language, every degree, every word I'd swallowed for 2 years to keep myself safe and small and employed. His face was inches from mine, veins visible at his temples. Voice dropping to something meant to sound paternal but landing cruel. "You're lucky to have this job. Remember that." Around the table, no one moved. No one spoke. Several phones were definitely recording now, and something inside me cracked. Marcus Way had spent 30 years reading people the way other men read profit margins, and the woman in the pink uniform was the most interesting thing at this table. Not because she was being humiliated. He'd seen that before. The casual cruelty of men like Thomas Jenkins, who confused dominance with leadership. No, what caught his attention was how she held herself under fire. Her breathing was controlled, deliberate, the kind of pattern you learned in meditation or high-stakes negotiation. Her eyes never dropped, never pleaded. They stayed level, fixed on a point just past Thomas's shoulder, managing to be both present and absent simultaneously. That took training. Marcus had been evaluating Thomas for 6 months, considering whether Way Capital should back his European expansion. The numbers looked good, the pitch was polished, but numbers lied when convenient and polish hid cracks. This lunch was his final test, not of Thomas's business model, but of his character. How a man treated people who couldn't fight back told you everything about what he'd do when the contracts got complicated and the stakes got real. So far, Thomas was failing spectacularly. The waitress set down her plate with hands that trembled microscopically. Not from weakness, Marcus noted, but from restraint, like she was physically holding something back, Her posture was too good for someone who'd been working service jobs her whole life. Her wrist position when she'd poured wine earlier showed classical training. And when Thomas had made that comment in Mandarin, that vicious little joke about monkeys, Marcus had watched her eyes. She'd understood every word. The flicker of recognition, the brief tightening at her jaw, the way her breathing pattern had changed for exactly 2 seconds. He'd seen it all, which meant either she spoke Mandarin or she'd learned to recognize insults in multiple languages through sheer survival necessity. Either way, she was far more than what Thomas assumed. Marcus leaned forward slightly, drawing her attention without making it obvious. He spoke in French, his tone conversational, the words carefully chosen. Pardonnez-moi, mademoiselle. Pourriez-vous nous recommander quelque chose de menu que Monsieur Jenkins n'a pas déjà commandé pour nous? Excuse me, miss. Could you recommend something from the menu that Mr. Jenkins hasn't already ordered for us? It was a test, a gentle one, phrased as a simple question, but layered with subtext. He was asking her to step out of her assigned role to offer expertise, to speak in a language Thomas clearly didn't understand based on his blank expression. He was offering her a door. The table went quiet. Thomas frowned, irritated at losing control of the conversation. The other investors glanced between Marcus and the waitress, suddenly curious. She stood there, plate still in hand, and Marcus watched something shift behind her eyes. Not fear, not gratitude, something harder, sharper. Decision. I looked at the man in the blue suit, really looked at him for the first time, and saw the invitation in his eyes. He'd asked me a question in French, but he wasn't asking about food recommendations. He was asking if I was going to keep pretending. My hand came up, not defensively, not in surrender. One finger raised between Thomas and me, a line drawn in air, a boundary I'd never allowed myself before. Un moment, s'il vous plaît. One moment, please. My voice came out steady, clear, nothing like the apologetic whisper I'd been using. I turned to the man in blue, and the French flowed like I'd never stopped speaking it. Je vous recommanderais le bar en croûte de sel avec les légumes de saison. Le chef le prépare remarquablement bien, et il complète les notes du vin blanc que vous avez choisi. I would recommend the salt-crusted sea bass with seasonal vegetables. The chef prepares it remarkably well, and it complements the notes of the white wine you've chosen. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. Thomas's face went from confused to red. What the hell do you think you're... I turned to the Chinese investor, the one Thomas had just insulted in Mandarin, calling us monkeys. My voice shifted. Tones precise, respect embedded in every syllable. Xiansheng wo wei gang kai de bu bian shen biao qian yi. Ling wai wo xiang rang nin ji dao wo wan quan li jie liao gang kai yong zhong wen shuo de hua. Nin de dan yu guan yu wen hua zheng he shi wan quan zheng kui de. Sir, I deeply apologize for the earlier inconvenience. Additionally, I want you to know that I completely understood what was said in Mandarin just now. Your concerns about cultural integration are entirely valid. The investor's water glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened. Wait, Thomas started, but I was already moving. To the German investor, in the language he'd used to order wine, the order Thomas had falsely claimed I'd gotten wrong. Entschuldigung, aber Sie hatten tatsächlich den 2016 Jahrgang bestellt, nicht den 2015. Ich hatte Ihre Bestellung korrekt aufgenommen. Excuse me, but you actually ordered the 2016 vintage, not the 2015. I had taken your order correctly. The German man's mouth opened slightly. He glanced at Thomas, then back at me. To the woman in the blazer, who'd been silent all lunch, I switched to Portuguese. I'd heard her take a phone call earlier in the corner. E sobre questa da responsabilidade social corporativa que a senhora mencionou antes, o senhor Jenkins simplificou demais a resposta. Os parceiros locais que ele mencionou não têm o histórico que ele sugeriu. And regarding the corporate social responsibility question you mentioned earlier, Mr. Jenkins oversimplified the answer. The local partners he mentioned don't have the track record he suggested. Gasps rippled around the table. Phones that had been recording Thomas's tirade now swung toward me. The terrace had gone completely silent. Other diners were watching, staff frozen mid-service. Thomas stood there, face cycling through confusion, rage, and something that might have been fear. How? You can't... I set down the plate I'd been holding through his entire humiliation. My hands were no longer shaking. I can actually. 7 languages, 2 master's degrees. 5 years building international partnerships before someone decided I was too competent for comfort. I looked directly at him, and I understood every single word you said about me. in every language. The man in blue was openly smiling now. The Chinese investor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, reassessing everything. The German investor pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Thomas's mouth worked silently. The emperor with no clothes, finally seeing his reflection. The Chinese investor spoke first, his voice calm but edged with steel. He addressed me directly, ignoring Thomas completely. Miss, when Mr. Jenkins described our partnership structure in Mandarin earlier, he used a phrase that translates roughly to silent beneficiary arrangement. Can you clarify what he meant by that? I could feel Thomas radiating panic beside me, but I kept my focus on the investor. He used the term Bei Hu Laoban, which actually means hidden boss or person pulling strings from behind. It implies a lack of transparency in power structure. I don't believe he understood the connotation. The investor's expression hardened. No, I don't believe he did. He turned to Thomas. That phrase suggests I would be a secret controller, which violates disclosure requirements in 3 countries where we operate. Were you planning to structure this deal in a way that puts my firm at legal risk? That's not. I didn't mean, Thomas stammered, his commanding presence evaporating. It was just a figure of speech. In Mandarin, there are no just figures of speech. The investor's voice could have cut glass. Every word carries legal and cultural weight. Miss, he looked at me expectantly. Andriana Johnson. Miss Johnson, what should he have said? I hesitated for half a second, feeling the weight of every eye at the table. Then I stepped fully into the space Thomas had tried to crush me out of. Hezuo Huoban, equal partnership, or Jean-Lu Tuzije, strategic investor. Either phrase conveys respect and transparency. The German investor leaned forward. Miss Johnson, during our preliminary discussions, Mr. Jenkins assured me that his Berlin team had established relationships with local government officials. He used the word Beziehungen, but you corrected something earlier. He confused Beziehungen with Bestechung, I said quietly. Relationships versus bribes. They sound similar to non-native speakers, but Bestechung implies corruption. If he's been using that word in meetings, he's been accidentally suggesting his German operations involve illegal payments to officials. The German man went pale. He turned to Thomas, rapid-fire German pouring out, too fast for most of the table to follow. Thomas stood frozen, clearly catching only every third word, his face cycling through shades of red. The woman in the blazer spoke up, her Portuguese accent thicker now that she wasn't trying to hide it. Mr. Jenkins told me Brazilian environmental regulations were flexible in our preliminary calls. Miss Johnson, you mentioned something about his local partners? I wanted to stop. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 years of survival screamed at me to step back, apologize, disappear. But the man in blue was nodding slightly, encouraging, and Thomas's empire was already crumbling. I might as well tell the truth. The environmental certification his partners claimed to have? It was revoked 8 months ago for falsified impact assessments. It's public record if you know where to look. In Portuguese. I met her eyes. He's promising you access to protected land that legally cannot be developed without triggering massive fines and international sanctions. She stood up, actually stood up from the table. My firm is not going to be associated with environmental fraud. I need to make a phone call. She walked away, phone already at her ear. Thomas finally found his voice. You have no right. You're just a... He reached for his old script, trying to reassert dominance through volume. You're a waitress. You serve food. You don't get to sabotage? I'm explaining what you've already sabotaged yourself, I said, and my voice didn't shake. Every word you said wrong, every cultural insult you didn't understand you were making, every mistranslation, that was you. I'm just clarifying so these people don't lose billions on a partnership with someone who can't be bothered to learn their languages or respect their cultures. The man in blue stood smoothly. Miss Johnson, could you spare 15 minutes after this? I'd like to discuss some consulting opportunities. The German investor stood next, gathering his folders with deliberate movements. Mr. Jenkins, I think we need to postpone our agreement until my legal team reviews every communication you've had with Berlin. If Miss Johnson's assessment is accurate, and I suspect it is, we have significant exposure issues to address. Thomas looked like a man watching his kingdom dissolve in real time. Gentlemen, please, let's not be hasty. This is a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, the Chinese investor cut in, his English precise, is that we assumed you understood the languages and cultures you claimed expertise in. Miss Johnson has demonstrated in 5 minutes what you failed to grasp in 5 months of negotiation. He looked at me with something approaching respect. Your skill set is remarkable, and clearly wasted here. The man in blue, I still didn't know his name, pulled out a slim leather business card holder. Miss Johnson, my name is Marcus Wei Capital. We specialize in cross-cultural mergers and international partnerships. We've been looking for a senior cultural liaison for 8 months. Someone with your linguistic range and analytical precision would be an asset we couldn't afford to pass up. He held out a card embossed with gold lettering. That's my direct line. I'd like to discuss a position. Salary starts at $175,000. Full benefits. Visa sponsorship if needed. The world tilted. I stared at the card like it might disappear if I breathed wrong. $175,000. That was more than I'd made in 3 years combined. Now wait just a minute. Thomas found his voice. Desperation making it sharp. You can't poach staff from... She's not staff, Thomas. She's the only reason you're not losing $4 billion today. Marcus's tone was pleasant, but underneath it ran steel. And if you want any chance of salvaging even part of this deal, I suggest you apologize, publicly, to Miss Johnson and to this table. Thomas's face went through several colors. Around us, other diners were openly watching now, phones still recording. The viral moment was already happening. Billionaire humiliated by brilliant waitress was the headline writing itself. He could either lean into humility or become the villain of the internet by tomorrow morning. His jaw worked, his hands clenched. Then, slowly, like a building collapsing from the inside, his shoulders dropped. Miss Johnson! He couldn't quite look at me. I apologize for my behavior. It was unprofessional and inexcusable. Your talents clearly far exceed this position, and I allowed stress to make me cruel. He turned to the remaining investors. Gentlemen, I deeply regret any offense caused today. I clearly have significant learning to do about cultural sensitivity. It was the most forced apology I'd ever heard. But it was public, recorded, and probably the only genuine moment of humility Thomas Jenkins had experienced in decades. Richard appeared at the edge of the terrace, his face pale with whatever combination of terror and confusion he was feeling. Andriana, could I speak with you for a moment? I tucked Marcus Wei's card into my uniform pocket like it was made of glass and dreams. Of course! We walked toward the service area, and I could feel Richard preparing to fire me, to smooth things over with Thomas, to sacrifice me to preserve the restaurant's relationship with a billionaire client. But before he could speak, Marcus Wei appeared beside us, moving with the kind of casual authority that came from actually having power rather than just performing it. Excuse me, he said pleasantly to Richard, but I need Miss Johnson's availability for consulting work starting as soon as possible. I assume her 2 weeks' notice is standard? It wasn't a question. Richard's mouth opened, closed. Yes, standard, Marcus smiled. Excellent. Miss Johnson, my assistant will call you this evening to arrange a formal interview, though between us, the position is yours if you want it. He nodded once, then returned to the terrace already on his phone. I stood in my pink uniform, in the restaurant where I'd been invisible for 2 years, holding a business card that felt like a key to a door I thought I'd lost forever. Richard stared at me. What just happened? I stopped hiding, I said, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled like I meant it. 3 weeks later, I stood in a glass-walled conference room on the 62nd floor of Wei Capital's headquarters, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that actually fit, negotiating contract terms with a legal team that treated me like I belonged there. Because I did. Marcus Wei sat at the head of the table, listening as I outlined my conditions. Not requests, conditions. I'd learned the difference. Full intellectual property rights to any cultural frameworks I develop. My name on all reports I author. And a clause that allows me to terminate immediately if anyone attempts to undermine my professional reputation through back-channel communications. The head lawyer raised an eyebrow. That's unusually specific. I've been burned before, I said simply. I won't be again. Marcus nodded. Agreed. Add it to the contract. He slid a folder across the table. You'll also notice we've included immigration sponsorship for a green card, not just a work visa. You've earned security, not just employment. My throat tightened. I'd spent 2 years feeling temporary, disposable, one bad day away from losing everything. This was permanence. This was a future I could actually plan for. There's one more thing, Marcus said, and something in his tone made me look up. Thomas Jenkins has requested a meeting with you. The room temperature seemed to drop. Absolutely not. Before you refuse, understand what he's asking for. His entire European expansion depends on repairing the damage from that lunch. 3 of his investors have made it clear. They'll only move forward if you're consulting on the cultural integration. He needs you, Andriana, and he knows it. I stood, walked to the window, looked down at the city that had watched me shrink myself for survival. Thomas Jenkins wanted me to save him. The irony tasted like justice and poison mixed together. If I agree, I said slowly, it's on my terms, my rate, my boundaries, and the first meeting happens here, with your legal team present. Of course, Marcus's voice held approval. He's waiting in conference room B. Has been for 20 minutes. My heart kicked. Now? You're the one with the power here, Andriana. He waits as long as you need him to. I took a breath, straightened my suit jacket, remembered the woman in the pink uniform who'd raised one finger and drawn a line. That woman was still in me, but she wasn't all of me anymore. Conference room B was smaller, more intimate. Thomas Jenkins stood by the window, the same position I'd just been in, hands in his pockets, looking diminished somehow despite the expensive suit. He turned when I entered, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Fear. Not of me specifically. Fear of irrelevance. Of having everything and losing it because he'd never learned to see people as anything other than obstacles or tools. Miss Johnson. He didn't move toward me. Smart. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I sat. Didn't invite him to. Let him stand. Let him feel what it was like to be the one waiting for permission to speak. You have 15 minutes. He flinched at the time limit but didn't argue. I need your help. The expansion deal is dying. My investors don't trust me anymore, and they're right not to. I've spent 20 years building an empire on assumptions and arrogance, and you dismantled it in 5 minutes by simply telling the truth. He finally moved, sat across from me, and for the first time looked at me like I was a person and not furniture. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to teach me. To consult on this deal, yes, but also to help me understand what I've been getting wrong. Before I lose everything. Why should I? The question came out flat. You called me dumb. You tried to humiliate me into silence. You used me as a prop to impress people you were already losing. I know. His voice cracked slightly, and I'm ashamed of that. Not because it backfired, because it was cruel, because you deserve better, and I was too insecure to admit that someone in a pink uniform could be smarter than me. He met my eyes. I can't undo what I did, but I can pay you extremely well to ensure I never do it again. To anyone. Silence stretched between us. Outside the glass walls, the city hummed with movement and possibility. $500 per hour, I said. Non-negotiable. Every communication goes through Marcus Way's office. You don't contact me directly. You don't show up at my apartment. You don't try to manage me like staff. I'm a consultant. You're a client who needs expertise you don't have. Those are the boundaries. Agreed. He pulled out a checkbook, actual paper, like he'd prepared for this. I'd like to retain you for 100 hours up front. That's $50,000. Consider it an apology payment and a deposit on humility. I watched him write the check, his hand steady despite everything. When he slid it across the table, I didn't pick it up immediately. This doesn't make us friends, Mr. Jenkins. I know. And it doesn't erase what you did. I know that too. I took the check, folded it carefully, looked at the man who'd tried to crush me and saw something unexpected, potential. Not for romance, not yet, maybe never. But for the kind of transformation that only happens when someone's world breaks open and forces them to rebuild differently. Then let's begin, I said. Lesson 1, when you don't know something, say so. Ignorance admitted is fixable. Ignorance performed as confidence destroys everything. Thomas Jenkins nodded, pulled out a notebook, and started taking notes like his empire depended on it. Because it did, and this time the woman holding the pen was me.